Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we are in round 4 of the 2015 Norway chess tournament. We have a cool match today. 2 of the top 4 players in the world. Rematch of the 2014 World Chess Championships. White's going to be played by none other than Vishy Anand. Black's going to be played by Magnus Carlsen. Magnus Carlsen having a rough go in his home country. He started out with 2 losses. First round lost because of time when he had a winning position. Next round did not play very well, made a mistake, and it cost him. And then the last round had a tie. So he needs to really get back on his horse and start getting some wins. Even draws are going to be tough with such a strong field here. So we'll go ahead and get into it. Vishy Anand starts with pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then bishop here to b5. Magnus Carlsen running into the Rai Lopez quite often, and it's been kind of customary for him to play the Berlin defense. Knight to f6, decides to start with something a little bit different. So excited for something new. Always fun to see that. So pawn to a6. We see bishop back here to a4. So some of the more common, don't see the exchange variation as much. Bishop taking here on c6. And then we see knight to f6 and then castle on the king side. Bishop here to e7. Bishop to e7, maybe not the most common play that you'll see. You may see bishop to c5. That's an option. You could see pawn here to d6 right away. You could even see knight to e4, but decides to go for bishop to e7, getting ready for a quick castle on the king side. Pawn to d3, pawn to d6, and then pawn to c3. So a little interesting. White did have the option of first bringing his knight here to c3. All of these are fine. They're all kind of created equal in some respect. It's all about the preparation that these players have. So they've probably studied many hours with other teammates, some of their training partners to go over some of these specific lines. So pawn to c3, this is going to kind of block off this knight, but looking to bring the knight here to d2 and then get it involved somewhere else on the board. Can always come to c4 if it needs to. Can always come over here to f1. It's a common thing we'll see after the rook over here to e1 and then try to count to start an attack on the king side. So castle on the king side for Magnus Carlsen, and then knight to d2 as we talked about. Rook over here to e8. So no pieces coming off the board, no pawn exchanges or anything. So both sides playing somewhat, non-aggressive, not really trying to do anything too crazy yet. We now see rook over here to e1, pawn to b5, forcing the bishop back. The bishop can come to b3 or c2. Both are going to be fine. Vishy Anand decides to go ahead and come back here with bishop here to c2, bishop back here to f8. So both sides, staying kind of back. They're not being too aggressive on both fronts. Knight here to f1, as we talked about, one of the options, just kind of maneuvering all of the pieces over to the king side. Pawn to g6, maneuvering the bishop a little around, so the bishop will eventually come here to g7, being fianchettoed here on the g7 square instead of this e7, which early on, it doesn't make too much of a difference. It's kind of a logjam here in the middle, so it doesn't matter that moving some of these minor pieces twice, your opponent doesn't have a ton of room to kind of move and take advantage of that. So it's completely fine to kind of maneuver this bishop back here to f8 where it was, and then come to g7. Now we see pawn to h3, bishop here to b7, knight to g3. So white looking to eventually attack on the king side, has both of the knights here. If ever wants to kind of jump in, maybe the knight to g5, could always come knight to h2, then knight to g4. Nice little outpost attacking this knight. If he had a bishop here on g5, have a pinned down piece to the queen, so the queen might want to move. Some of the options that Vishy Anand has later in the game. Knight to b8 is a pretty interesting move. This is the Breyer variation. It became kind of famous in the 1960s when Spassky played it and played it very well. White always had a tough time really knowing what to do. It kind of looks weird. You bring your knight here to c6, and then a little bit later on you bring it back here to b8. But this actually does a lot for black. It allows them to open up the board for the light square bishop to kind of control this long diagonal. It also opens up for this C pawn to actually start pushing forward. Usually in the Rai Lopez defense specifically, this pawn here on C7 doesn't move much. So now that we've castled on the king side for black, this pawn can push forward, put a lot of pressure on the queen side. The knight can always come over here to D7, protect this pawn here on E5. So going to be completely fine for black as Magnus Carlsen is trying to find some weird variation that he can kind of break through and hopefully get a win against Vishy Anand. Pawn to D4, looking to potentially break up the center of the board. We still have no pieces come off the board at all, no pawns going anywhere. Knight to D7, we did talk about this move, probably going to happen. Pawn over here to A4, kind of looking to attack on the queen side. This pawn here on B5 is somewhat threatening for black, so just kind of counterattacking here with A4. It's interesting because at any time, white could just kind of blow things up. Could play pawn taking here on D5. After the exchange, we could see some pieces come off the board. We could see white even take here on D8. And then all of a sudden, almost all the big pieces in the center of the board are gone. We have some opening here. Both sides trying to jockey to gain control of the D file. Both sides still have bishop pairs, so you may try to open up the board a little bit more. But more than likely, it's probably going to go down to a drawish endgame. But decides instead of that to play pawn here to A4 and then pawn here to C5. Magnus Carlsen counterattacking on the queen side as well. Pawn here to D5, kind of locking this light square bishop up, which I think is great plan. Anytime you can limit the squares your opponents can move, that's always going to be a good thing. So this gains some space for Vishy Anand. This light square bishop, this dark square bishop's not going anywhere. So it's, it could eventually come here to G7, but even that's not doing too much. It's kind of blocked by both this knight and this pawn. So Vishy Anand's going to be able to have a much more active game with his bishops. The light square bishop may not be as active as the dark square bishop, but all in all, Vishy Anand probably has a slightly better position in this board state than Magnus Carlsen. Now we see pawn to C4, bishop here to G5. Vishy Anand getting his pieces more involved into the action. He has the most aggressive bishop in the game, so decides to go ahead and get that out here. Pin down this knight to the queen, very important. The queen could always come to C7. I really like this move. Just don't even have to worry about it. You do have the knight here on D7, which isn't going really anywhere else right now. Potentially, if he wanted to use this outpost on C5, he definitely could. But right now, it's doing fine just holding down the fort to this knight here on F6. So could always play the queen here to C7 if he wanted to. Decides to first play bishop here to G7. This way, even if he plays queen to C7, he can still bring his knight to C5. Great outpost move, attacking this pawn central square that white's going to have to deal with as far as protecting that. So that's going to be something Magnus Carlsen's going to be looking at. Queen here to D2, rook over here to B8, and then knight to H2. And if we kind of look at white's board state as far as the options he has, so far neither side has really blinked first. We don't have any material off the board. It's very clogged up right now. If we look at white's options, he could always retreat his bishop back. Bishop here to E3 is completely fine. Both sides have been moving their pieces back and forth, just small improvements, waiting to see what their opponents does. Doesn't necessarily want to blow up maybe the queen side right now. The rook has come over here recognizing that, hey, something may happen on this B file. That's going to be fine. The rook could always come here to, let's say, A3. Maybe he wants to kind of double barrel, bring his other rook over here to A1. That's completely fine. Break open this queen file over here on the A rank, and then, start to push forward. That's good. We could also see the queen come to E3, another option right here. None of these are really putting too much pressure on black. Doesn't really tell Magnus Carlsen that Vishy wants to do anything crazy, but knight to H2 basically says it's go time, because there's no reason to do knight to H2 unless you are looking to play knight to G4. And G4 signifies, hey, we're getting ready to rumble on the king side. I'm going for an attack. So Magnus Carlsen has to look at this and say, okay, this knight's going to come here to G4. Then you're going to be putting a lot of pressure on my own knight on F6. And it's being pinned down to the queen on D8. And that is very problematic to deal with. Me personally, I would just take this opportunity and just play my queen to C7. keep it safe, Magnus Carlsen decides to go for a little different option, plays bishop here to c8. Then we see knight to g4, as we talked about. Vishy and Anand deciding to start to attack on the king side. Now knight to c5. We do see the outpost from Magnus Carlsen. And then knight up here to h6. Now, this is check, and so black has to deal with that. But if we come back and look, okay, so let's say instead of the bishop to b7 or to c8, we see queen to c7. Now, if the knight were to come up here, we could see an exchange off the board after the pawn takes. Then all of a sudden, the knight comes down here to c5. White has double pawns on the g file. All of a sudden, black has a nice little outpost here. There's no huge threat. This knight can't come here to f5, can't come here to h5 because of this pawn right here. The black king is completely protected, and it's very easy now for Magnus Carlsen to get his bishop involved. Bishop here to c8 can now attack this pawn here. It's somewhat awkward for Vishy and Anand to try to hold on to that unless he wants to open up the dark squares along this diagonal right here. So all in all, I like this position better. Magnus Carlsen decided to go for another option. So the bishop here to c8 is the line they take, but I always like to go over some additional lines that you may not see in the game, that some of the commentators that were going over the game and myself as I was kind of watching it were thinking about as well. So knight to c5, now knight up to h6 check. We do see an exchange off the board, and then the pawn taking here on a4. Now, black is up material right now, and white could decide to go ahead and take the material back. Decides to go and first play rook here to a2, knowing that this pawn could be captured if white wants to. He does have both his rook and his bishop both eyeing it, but decides first to play a rook here to a2. Now pawn to a3, saying, okay, I know I'm going to lose this material, but that's going to be completely okay. If we come back, I think white even had another option. He could have played bishop here to e3, knowing that this rook could take. But if the rook takes here on b2, he does have some options. The bishop could take here on c5. If we do see an exchange on board, now the queen comes back here to c1. The rook's going to have to move. Now the bishop can take. Black has a horrible pawn structure, double pawns on the c file without anything on the b or d file. That's not going to be good. White has a very active position. So I see that there was a threat here on b2, but I think it'd be completely okay to just bring the bishop back here to e3. And even if the queen were to come, let's say queen to c7, trying to hold down the fort with the knight here on c5, we could still see the bishop take and then the queen take, and now the bishop takes here on a4. And the rook can't really come down here to b2. It's protected by the queen, but even more than that, the bishop is attacking this rook here on e8. So some of the other options that Vishy and Anand had, decided to play it a little closer to the vest and just play the rook here to a2, and then Magnus Carlsen giving that material back, pawn here to a3, and then we just see the pawn take here on a3. Magnus brings his knight back here to d7, and then pawn to f4. Pretty aggressive move from Vishy and Anand. He had some other options as far as playing a little bit maybe more passive, but decides to just go for the jugular. Pawn here to f4, trying to blow stuff up. He kind of has his opponent on the rope right here, and so decides to just continue to attack. Pawn here to a5, rook over here to f1. Since you're going to be pushing pawns, your rooks always belong your pawns as you're pushing them. Semi-open files, open files, or just important files. And this f file, all of a sudden, it became pretty important. So he brings his rook over here. Now we're going to see pawn here to f6, pawn here to f5, so Vishy and Anand's pushing forward. Knight to d2 or d3, definitely a nice outpost, but Vishy and Anand, he doesn't really care too much about his light square bishop. It has not been doing anything all game long. It's been kind of just sitting there. So decides, hey, here's a great opportunity to go ahead and exchange off the board right now. Comes back here to queen to d1. Doesn't have to worry right now about this pawn. It's not using it doesn't have a huge threat right now. There's no way for black to really push forward, and so decides to just, hey, let's improve the position. I have a strong attack going over here on the king side, so let's focus on that. Rook here to e7. Magnus Carlsen recognized that, hey, I got to start to build up a defense because Vishy's coming for me. Rook over here to f2. Rook here to f7, and now the queen decides to go ahead and take. Knight here to c5, the outpost that he had the knight on before. Queen over here to f3. So all of the material kind of lined up to start to attack Magnus Carlsen on the king side. Magnus, though, if we look at it, he still doesn't have a active light square bishop, and this light square bishop hasn't done much all game long. It's kind of bounced back between b7 and c8, but hasn't really had a lot of room to move. This knight here on c5 has a nice outpost on the completely opposite side of the board. The rook here on b8 is controlling the only open file on the board, completely away from the action. So you may have heard this in some of my other videos if you've kind of been watching for a while. It's not about the material you have. It's about the material you have in the fight. And Vishy and Anand, just by looking at this board state, we can tell he has a lot of material in the fight. Magnus Carlsen is going to have to find a creative way to get out of this because he's going to have a lot of material flying at his king very, very soon. Magnus now plays his bishop to a6, attacking this rook here on f1. Vishy and Anand could care less because he has way too many pieces attacking. He's just going to let this go if Magnus Carlsen wants to take it. Pawn to g5. And then pawn up here to h4, kind of breaking this open. I'm not even sure if Magnus Carlsen realized that, hey, pawn to h4 just kind of blows all this up. Pawn can't take, so decides to go ahead and take this rook here on f1. Again, Vishy and Anand does not care too much, but he decides to go ahead and take it with his rook. Now we see the queen to d7. We see the pawn take here on g5. We do see an exchange right here. Queen up here to h5, just improving the position. And then pawn to f6. Now, I really thought Vishy and Anand was just going to take with this queen right here. And then you could see the rook come over here to g8, and then queen back here to h4. I think this is completely fine. But the more I've looked at it, I really like Vishy and Anand's play. Pawn here to f6. Now after rook here to g8. Bishop here to g7 is a great outpost move. It essentially forces black to make an exchange right here and now have this open file for this rook here to control. And white really still has this very aggressive queen right here on h5. Much better than it was in the previous example that I just showed. So this is very good. Magnus Carlsen, as we can tell, has to take this because his king can't move anywhere. So after the take right here, we now see knight coming up here to f5, outpost, attacking the queen. The queen is forced to move. And then after the exchange right here, we see the knight come up here to e7. King's going to move, and then taking the rook here on g6. And then the rook's going to become very, very potent, getting behind enemy lines. And he can just pretty much gobble up all of this material. Rook is always going to dominate a knight in the endgame. So even though both sides have equal material as far as pawns, the rook is just so far better than the opponent's knight. It's just not even funny. So pawn to a4, knight to c4, and then after just a few more moves, knight here to f2, and Magnus Carlsen is forced to resign. So congratulations to Vishy and Anand. I'm not sure if he just smelt water in the or blood in the water because Magnus Carlsen has just been getting pounded this entire tournament, or if he just decided, hey, I'm tired of playing passive against Magnus Carlsen. He's beat me in the last 2 world championships. I'm just going to come out, play my game, be super aggressive, which he's typically not against Magnus Carlsen, and then just see what happens. But that's what he did. He was super aggressive. It paid off. Magnus Carlsen was pretty much playing defense the entire time. Couldn't really get his pieces activated. They were just back here kind of dancing around. Never had an opportunity to have any sort of counterplay on any of the board. Vishy and Anand, too much pressure. So Magnus Carlsen is going to have to find some miracle if he wants to come back and even place decently in this tournament. Vishy and Anand now puts himself in contention to win this thing, definitely in the medal stand for sure. So fantastic match. Just in round 4, we've seen some fantastic play. Usually going to happen when you have the best players in the world in one tournament. So hopefully you guys enjoyed. I will see you guys in round 5. Thanks for watching.